Passover is one of the most familiar holidays we celebrate. It's the matzo ball soup, the long table, the half-remembered songs, and for some people it even includes that unmistakable gelatinous gefilte fish that somehow makes it onto our plates every single year. Any gefilte fish fans? No, not me. Yet the homemade stuff is wonderful, but that stuff in the jar, I can't do it. All that is part of the experience. It's warm, it's communal, it's deeply rooted in memory. But according to the Kabbalists, that's not only what Passover is about. At its core, Passover is an invitation to explore and recreate ourselves. The Haggadah tells us that in every generation, each person is obligated to see themselves as if they personally went out of Egypt. And that's a pretty demanding statement. Not that we should remember what happened, not that we should honor our ancestors, but that we should experience it ourselves. So what does that mean? Was Egypt only a physical place, a location on a map where something happened long ago? Or is Egypt a kind of inner condition, a state of constriction, limitation, of being stuck in patterns we can't seem to break? The Hebrew word for Egypt, Mitzrayim, comes from the root Meitzar, which means narrowness or constriction. It suggests that Egypt is not only where we were, but an opportunity to discover where we want to be. If that's the case, then the story of Passover isn't only about leaving a place, it's about becoming someone new. And that raises a different kind of question, not how our ancestors were freed, but how we might begin to free ourselves. Recently, I was talking to a family friend. He's in his early 20s, and we're close enough that he calls me Uncle Dave. We were at a Shabbat dinner at his mother's house, and he asked me how to begin developing himself spiritually. I paused for a moment, and knowing that he was about to take a long flight to London for a family vacation, I suggested that he remain silent for the entire flight. Oh. He looked at me a little confused. What does that mean, he asked. Don't do anything. No phone, no phone. No music, no music. Well, what am I supposed to do? And I said, nothing. Now, recent data shows that young adults spend enormous portions of their days filling space. Americans aged 18 to 29 report 7 to 12 hours of daily screen time, with many Gen Z averaging close to 9 hours a day, more than half their waking time. Audio adds even more. Americans spend nearly 4 hours a day listening to music, podcasts, or radio. That means most waking minutes are filled, and while none of this is inherently negative, I'm not being a Luddite here, it pulls away from what is directly in front of us, the beauty of the world, stillness, and face-to-face relationships. And we're beginning to see how this affects us. Higher levels of screen time, especially social media use, are consistently associated with increased anxiety, difficulty concentrating, and disrupted sleep. Constant input leaves very little space for the mind to settle. Attention becomes fragmented, even rest begins to feel restless, and relationships can become thinner, more frequent, but less meaningful. And none of this is about blaming technology. That's not what I'm doing. It's about noticing its effect. When every moment is filled, there's no room to process experience, no room for quiet, no room for reflection. And without that space, it becomes harder to feel grounded, connected, and fully alive in the world around us. So if that's the case, then the question is not only what technology is doing to us, but what it reveals about us. Why is silence so difficult? I didn't do it today. Even silent prayer is not silent. Although I love Nathan, we usually play like 3 notes and let it sit. So he actually does create some silence, which is really
for it.
yeah, which is really, really nice. And there are very few synagogues that do that. It's like, now for silent prayer, and then the piano plays all the way through it, you know. So if that's the case, the question is not only what technology is doing to us, but what it reveals about us. Why is silence so difficult? Why do we move so quickly to fill it? What begins as a behavior so ingrained within us that we don't even notice, it often points to something deeper. We're uncomfortable with stillness, we resist being alone with our own thoughts. And that discomfort is productive. It shows us where we're not yet free. It shows us the places where we feel confined without even realizing it. What looks like a distraction may actually be a signal and an invitation to pay attention to where we are still living in a kind of inner narrowness. So let's move this idea back into a Jewish context and turn to the Rebbe Rashab. He reads this double meaning of Mitzrayim, Egypt, Meitzar, constriction as a stage in an inner process. For the Rashab, narrowness is not simply a condition to escape, it's something we become aware of, work through, and ultimately transform. The feeling of being stuck, limited, or confined is itself the beginning of spiritual growth. It forces a person to confront where they're closed and where they're not yet free, and that awareness becomes the first step towards expansion. All right, well, I'm going to return to the family friend now, and I have to admit that asking a 22-year-old to sit silently for 8 hours was probably a bit more of a reach than I planned. Starting with 15 minutes, then 30, then an hour, building gradually would have made more sense. That said, he did it, and he told me afterward that it was incredibly difficult. The impulse to reach for something, to fill the space, was constant. But he stayed with it, and I'd like to think that in doing so, he began to notice things he normally wouldn't, his own thoughts, his restlessness, and moments of quiet. And I hope that over time, he would feel less empty and more full of life. And this kind of work is never occasional, it's ongoing. A person is always in the process of shaping themselves, whether they're aware of it or not. Changing the way that we live in the world is not easy. We do it slowly, through repetition. It takes steady effort, small, consistent shifts rather than dramatic change. Each moment becomes an opportunity to respond differently, to loosen what has become automatic. Spiritual growth in this view is not a breakthrough, but a practice. It's the quiet, persistent work of becoming just a little more open, a little less constrained again and again. So when the Haggadah tells us to see ourselves as if we personally left Egypt, it asks more than memory, it asks for experience. Egypt is not only where our ancestors were, it is the narrowness that we carry, the habits that shape us, the patterns that keep us confined. To leave Egypt is to begin to loosen those patterns, to interrupt what feels automatic, and to step beyond what has limited us. Freedom is not a single moment, it's a process. And in that process, we become something different, not all at once, but gradually, intentionally, a better version of ourselves. Shabbat Shalom and Chag Pesach Sameach.